Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I wanted to take a minute to reflect on, this was a very rich talk, beautiful details, and the book is as rich, if not richer.
Thank you.
It is peppered with anecdotes, with smells, with sounds, with movement. And yet it's in contrast with your previous book, because your previous book was about Alexander von Humboldt, who couldn't sit still. And if we followed you and Alexander over the world, we were happy when Alexander traveled, and we were morose with Alexander when he was back in Tego or on an attic in Paris. So that was a book of movement, of travel. And this is a book of situation. It's one place. Jena is more or less a character in the book. Was that clear to you immediately, that this should be a book about one place?
Yes, because I found the story as I was doing the research for Humboldt, because in the Humboldt book I have a chapter about his friendship with Goethe, which started in Jena. So as I was doing my research in Jena and I walked through the streets, I could see all these name plaques on the houses of all these super famous people, and I couldn't quite believe my eyes. And then I worked out that they were all there at the same time in the same place. So it became pretty clear for me that Jena is part of this story. Jena is a protagonist. That's why I'm trying to describe Jena as richly as I would describe a person, so that you can understand how it felt, how it smelled, how, if it was claustrophobic or not, how many people would you meet on the streets. But you're right, it was actually quite hard for me because I love traveling, and one of the joys of writing the Humboldt book was to travel, follow his footsteps up Chimborazo, down the Orinoco, and then suddenly I was like, oh, it's not quite the same as South America. But it turned out to be, as sometimes destiny works out, it's turned out to be the right book because I'd done all my research and then the pandemic hit. And if I had to travel, it would have been an absolute nightmare. If the pandemic had happened during the research for Humboldt, it would have been impossible. So this book was a book where I traveled in my mind with these, when all the bars and restaurants closed, when I couldn't see my friends anymore, I hung out with those guys, which was quite nice.
Yeah, that must have been wonderful. So speaking about your research, we saw one slide about letters, but there must have been, and this is, by the way, this is a warning to people who want to buy this book. Buy the book, but you see where the red thing is. That's almost where the endnotes begin. So there's so many notes.
Which you don't have to read.
Which you don't have to read. But don't reken jezelf niet rijk. Het boek is ietsjes dunner dan je denkt. So you went through so many letters, you collected so many letters. Can you take us through the nuts and bolts of your research? Because that must have been Herculean.
It's so much fun. So this is so rich because this is a group of writers and poets who all write letters to each other. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands. And not only letters between them, but Jena had almost 900 students who were writing letters to their parents, for example, describing Jena, describing these famous professors they had, when they went to concerts, who was sitting in one row. So there is a richness of primary material that I have never experienced before, because Humboldt wrote 50,000 letters, but these were mainly scientific letters. And so the private nuggets were really little treasures you had to find. Here it was, they gossip, they backstab each other. So you have this incredible material to really see what they ate, what they wore, how it smelled in Jena. There's one. I stumbled over this description by a student who wrote to his parents how one evening he was almost hit by a chamber pot, or by the content of a chamber pot, because after 11 o'clock, people in Jena were allowed to throw out the content of the chamber pot out of their window. So, you suddenly think, oh, that must have been a little bit smelly then, at that time of the night. So you just get so much from these descriptions. And then you have travelers who come to Jena who want to see these famous people who publish their descriptions of Jena.
But how, Andrea?
Oh, you really want the
I
nerdy
want to know
details.
the
Okay.
nuts and bolts.
So I'm very nerdy when it comes to this. So I have a database in which I transcribe every entry in a diary, every letter, and then I keyword it by key names, so who's mentioned in this letter, key places, which are the places that are mentioned in this letter, and keywords such as nature or gossip or illness or death or children. And then so while I do this, it takes a long, long time. But then when you come to writing, it is amazing because you can put in, say, I had a keyword lectures because I wanted to, these were all letters where lectures were described. So lectures, shelling, nature. So all the letters where someone describes shelling in his lectures, even those letters that were published, say, written in 1850 by a student who remembered as an old man how it was watching shelling in his lecture. So this is where, for example, this image comes from, how he lights the candles and how he kind of presents himself to his students.
And I think the book is full, even if you already know a bit about these people, it's full of surprises. And to me, one of the most surprising, one of the discoveries I cherish is how you recast Novalis, who is, of course, later sanctified by his friends, but you cast him as the inspector of the mines. And there is a wonderful scene where actually Schelling, I think it's Schelling, right? So many Friedrichs. But no, that's not you. Schelling comes down from Berlin and he travels to Jena, and on the way he stops. He wants to meet Novalis, but Novalis isn't there. So he thinks, I'm going to do what Novalis does. I'm going to inspect the mines, and you end the chapter with him in the mines of Novalis, between the coal seams of the ground where he is, which suddenly makes him less ephemeral and more grounded and probably more dusty than he is. What did you discover in those letters? What's a cherished discovery when you turned every page?
So of anyone?
Yeah, of anyone.
I mean, so I think one of the things I found absolutely amazing is about Goethe. Goethe, who's, in Germany, he's, the celebrated poet. He's on a pedestal. He's this kind of half-god, demigod who's, seems very serene, the way he's described. But he was so funny, and he was such a loving father. So there are amazing descriptions of, so for example, he sits in his study and he lets down a piece of cake and a rope for the children who are playing in the courtyard. The pain that, like friends describe, the pain he feels when his children, so there are a couple of very young babies that die, and how he suffers, how he throws himself on the floor and just cries and just throws himself into work to forget the pain. And then what a loving father he is, the letters he writes to his son, August, because Goethe spends almost half of his time in Jena. That's why I count him as the Jena set, although he lives in Weimar, but he stays in the old castle in Jena. But he writes, every other day he writes letters home, and they're so tender and so loving, and that was a real surprise for me, because I wanted to show these people in their context, not just through their work, because we all work, or most of us do, but we're not just defined through our work or our works. We are also very much defined through our families and friends and who we are. So I wanted to show them these kind of heroes of the German kind of, poets and thinkers in their daily life, with their flaws and all their, faults, really, also.
So Jena as a protagonist, that was clear from the beginning. But at least one who graces the cover and who's more or less the center of the web, Caroline. Was she there from the beginning?
No.
So how did you, Because she's not part of the historiography.
No, not really.
standardly, no.
If she's mentioned, she's kind of mentioned as the muse, who creates the kind of physical space. She really brought herself into the story through the letters. It became very clear when you read her letters, how incredibly smart she is and clever she is and educated she is, but also through the letters from the others, how when they describe her contributions, it became very, very clear what she meant to Friedrich Schlegel. It became very clear that she was the editor of their literary magazine, because Friedrich Schlegel gets upset that she's shortening his contributions. So in the letters, you suddenly realize this, or you have a letter from August Wilhelm Schlegel to Goethe explaining that one of the essays she wrote for the Athenaeum, that although his name is on the essay, it is written entirely by her. So it became clearer and clearer. Then you look at the manuscripts of their Shakespeare translation, and you see both of their handwritings, kind of how they, strike out phrases, and another person, that either she or he kind of writes a new word. So you can see it's a real collaboration. So it became, through the letters, very clear. Also the descriptions of the students who talk about her. So she is really at the center of this. And I think it was really time to give her also the space that she deserves. And so she was a great surprise, and a fun surprise, because and not only is she super smart and clever, but she's so fiercely independently minded and just does what she wants, which is just incredible to read.
Yeah, and just to make the point, you write how her essays on Shakespeare that were published but exclusively under the name of her husband are foundational for how the English now understand.
Yes, so August Wilhelm Schlegel publishes lectures on Shakespeare, which are very much informed by his discussion with Caroline. And these lectures, these published lectures, resurrect Shakespeare in England. So where he had been really, during the kind of earlier 18th century, he was regarded as vulgar, his language was seen as ungrammatical, and then he became the epitome of the romantic writer. So Byron, Shelley, Coleridge, Wordsworth, they all pick up Schlegel's book and learn about Shakespeare from a German. Which the English don't like to hear now.
Keep reminding them. Yeah. Also, and you mentioned that in your lecture, you don't spare them. You give them, you call it a soap opera. I think it's more than that. But you show the good and the bad. And of course, you are, to stay with Shakespeare, the Prospero of this book. We're on your island, and you make us feel what we need to feel, and you feel a lot going through the book. But that makes me wonder: how did your relation evolve with these characters? I mean, for me, for instance, I was a little bit disappointed in Schiller. I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Me too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Schiller, I suppose, was because he's on such a pedestal, and I think I always preferred Schiller to Goethe, and I came out of this book preferring Goethe, because Schiller he's so tense the whole time, and he is kind of thin-skinned, I think, and he thinks a lot about money. A lot of his writing is determined by, like, how can I make the most money out of my writing, which I can, as an independent scholar, I'm with him on that one a little bit. But it was quite shocking to see. I mean, that doesn't mean that he's a terrible person. I mean, he was incredibly kind with his time. For example, he helped female writers. He published them anonymously. His friendship with Goethe is amazing, and he's very generous with his time as he's editing Goethe's work. So I don't want to just trash him completely, but I definitely was a little bit disappointed by Schiller. But again, as you read his letters, and he's, what he writes about the others, sometimes he's a little bit petty. I mean, they are not very kind to him either. So it's never just one person's fault, but he's certainly more narrow-minded, put it this way, than I thought he was.
And also, and I think that moves with my next question, but also very willing to. His wife is, of course, from noble birth. He at some point becomes noble, but very willing to suddenly enforce certain social norms when he can. He suddenly becomes almost a man of honor.
They have a very traditional...
and he invokes it when he needs to.
Yeah, so the others, like August Wilhelm Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, very much believe in the equality between men and women. August Wilhelm Schlegel clearly does not have a problem with having a strong wife, as has Wilhelm von Humboldt not. But Schiller, I mean, and those of you who've read his poems also know this, that he describes women very much as the housewife, the mothers of the children, the compliant, beautiful wife, kind of gracious from the inside, beautiful from the outside. So, the man is the public figure, the woman is the one who kind of creates the private sphere. And the others are not like that. And the Schlegels are not like that. I mean, Fichte is also not too much into the women.
At the beginning of your talk, you pointed towards the central sort of tension in the book between the self, the liberated self, and selfishness. But I do think, and actually you also pointed towards it in the lecture, that there's also another sort of tension or paradox, and it has to do with politics. Because on the one hand, they are all very conscious of the French Revolution, and the book starts, of course, with the French Revolution in Mainz. They all are, of course, conscious of the fact that they live under these absolute rulers who they have to petition in order to leave a small duchy or to do something like that. So it's very at the foreground. And yet, I can't help to think throughout the book that they were sometimes very consciously apolitical. Schiller starts the magazine Horen and says, no politics. And I thought it was my discovery, but then I discovered again that you are Prospero, because I want to read a quote from Madame de Staël that you give. Building up tension. So Madame de Staël writes a book, Germany, for the French language market, about the Germans. And you're right, Madame de Staël talked and questioned relentlessly, but was surprised to discover that neither Goethe nor Schiller read political newspapers. German poets didn't seem to talk about politics, she noted. Instead, people followed Schelling's philosophy and preferred the ideal to reality. Maybe, she mused, Germans escaped to this ideal world because their world was so unsophisticated and restricted. The climate was harsh, the food was terrible, much like here, and they were still ruled by monarchs, princes, and dukes instead of by elected governments. Germans were living in their minds and found there what, and here you quote her, their limited destiny denies them on earth. So how do we, can you develop the paradox?
So I think she exaggerates a little bit there. They are not completely apolitical, but they are certainly not political activists, as we would understand. They're not revolutionaries who go on the barricades and fight. But they feel that they are fighting with their words. And I think that has to do a lot with the French Revolution, because the French Revolution, and I think we cannot underestimate that, was this moment where philosophers felt that they can change the world, because they were watching how the idea of a state was where a state was rising out of the idea of a state in France. So they were watching what was happening there, and they realized this comes from the ideas of freedom. So I think it's an incredible, powerful moment, and they write about this to each other. They say, the words are our weapons now. So I think they feel that they are political, but not in the sense how we would probably understand politics today, so not in a pragmatic way. And we should not forget that as they grow older, quite a lot of them become quite reactionary and conservative. Friedrich Schlegel, for example, ends up working for Metternich for example. And turns against, the French Revolution, Napoleon, and even when he publishes his collected work, so his erotic novel Lucinde is not part of that. He turns against his kind of the work of his youth, and that I think that's quite important to bear in mind also. So I think they are not actively political as we understand it today. But even Schiller, who says, who when he publishes Hören says, no politics in here. But what they do is they use arts and aesthetics and beauty as a political tool, because they believe, so bear with me for a second, so they were, except of Goethe, everybody was a great supporter of the French Revolution. But then as during Robespierre's time, the kind of thousands of heads rolled off the guillotines, some of them, quite a lot of Germans, were horrified by the excesses of the French Revolution. So Schiller writes in Hören that he believes that the French were just not ready for freedom and equality because they are morally not mature enough. And he explains this, he says that art, he calls art, so art is the tool, is the bulwark against greed, immorality, and brutality. So when they talk about morality, it's not the fidelity of a spouse or your sexuality, because in that department they're all clearly having fun. But they see morality in the sense of a society that's ready to govern itself, and they believe that beauty and aesthetics is a way of making people a better people. So what they say is the Enlightenment, with its focus on reason and empiricism, and all this knowledge cannot develop a person's sense of good and evil. Only art can do that. So for them, writing poetry is a political tool.
Okay, and I'm going to press that point a little further, because one way to think about that is to say that's escapism. And it was a thing that really sort of struck out to me when August Wilhelm talks about the importance of the French Revolution. And he says the importance of the French Revolution is that it gave us new words. I'm like, yeah, dude, I mean, is that the most important thing? So one way to look at this is it's they escape into art.
I don't think so. I think what you might be doing is you're looking at it through the prism of your own understanding of art today, which is something pretty and decorative maybe, or something like that. But for them it was a political tool. If it achieved anything, that's another question. But because for them, poetry, for example, if it makes a person a better person, then that person is a better member of a society, and that is a political act. That's how they understood it. They didn't see it as this is something nice, something pretty. It was much more radical, I think.
And as we are now witnessing a war on the European continent between an emerging democracy and autocracy, is there anything to learn then from then on that? Or am I pushing them into?
I think
you called them rebels, so
yeah,
I thought.
I think you might be pushing it a little bit. I think you can't use them for everything. But I would say what you could do is maybe you could say, if you think of the self as a free self comes with responsibilities. So if you make that self bigger and say it's the self of a nation, it also comes with responsibilities. So maybe other nations have responsibilities towards other nations. But I will leave it at that. I think I can't go. I think it might be pushing it a little bit too much.
No. They are rebels. They rebel against something else. And you said, well, if they're that effective, that's a different story. What was effective? What lasts about the rebellion? Did they give us a paradigm of what it means to be young, a paradigm of what it means to be brilliant or magnificent? What's this enduring?
I think they gave us the self. with all its flaws, but also with all its amazing power. And I think that is not to be underestimated. And I think they gave us a concept of nature that's really shaped the way we think about this world.
I would like to thank you
For
your wonderful lecture. Enduring with me. Give her a warm applause.
Thank you.
En de switch to Dutch. Voor de huishoudelijke mededelingen doe ik weer in het Nederlands. Dames en heren, hartelijk dank. Fijn dat u hier was. Ik raad u van harte aan het boek te kopen. Ofwel in het Engels, ofwel in het Nederlands. Dat kan daar. En u bent ook van harte uitgenodigd voor de 4e en laatste jubileumlezing. Die is op maandag 14 november. En dan komt de excentrieke Britse bioloog Merlin Sheldrake spreken over zijn baanbrekende boek Verwezen leven. En daarna Verweven leven. En daarna volgt een bijzondere voorstelling van Ramsi Nasser met het Rietquintet Calefax, die een half uur durende ode aan het kleinste leven spelen, grotendeels geïnspireerd op het boek van de auteur die er dan ook is. Dus ik hoop dat u er dan allemaal weer bent. En voor nu, koop dat boek en vindt u zelf. Hartelijk dank. Dank u.